Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Mountaineer Locker Room. Then and now, I'm Greg Christ, Frank Fear. To my left, as I'm looking at him, right, if I turn around the other way, and Mickey Plumley down below us. We welcome everybody to the show. We hope we have another good one for you. We think we will, and we always like to ask that you like and subscribe on our YouTube channel. That helps us to be able to keep doing this. And Frank, I think we got a great show lined up as we draw closer and closer to opening day, and I think everybody's getting a little more excited. We're not too far off, and we've got a great guest lined up tonight to talk about that.
We do. There's no one better than John Antonik, basically the resident historian, among other roles at WVU, and just a font of knowledge. And we're gonna look at opening games over the years, and we're just pleased that John took the time to be with us tonight.
We're tickled to death too, Mickey, that you're with us tonight. And first and foremost, we want to thank Mark Parsons and Mike Dunlap. Those two guys have been instrumental in helping us get this show going and keeping great guests lined up for us. They have. I told Mike one day he has more contacts than the president does in his phone, I'm sure, because he knows everybody. And Mark's the same way. Those guys have been very instrumental in helping us get this show off the ground and keep us going. And like I said, Mickey, great to see you back in action with us.
Good to be back with you, Greg. Frank, missed you guys.
Yeah, missed you too.
Yep, absolutely. Got your cup there lined up, trying to get it on the screen. I see.
I get the W logo up there. How's that? my daughter Sarah got this for me for Christmas, and I believe she is dialed in watching the show tonight.
That's
awesome,
great.
Awesome. Let her see the cup. That's for sure. Yeah, I have a niece that got me a cup for my course out with Coach Chris show. It's got the logo on it, so I always try to make sure I got that sitting somewhere where some people can see it, because she was very proud of that. That was a nice little gift. Well, Frank, if you get us started here, we'll bring John in and get going. Can't wait
Very
for this.
good. Welcome, John. There he is.
I'm outside. It's a beautiful day here in Morgantown. I just finished walking my dog, and my dog needs a lot of attention. But we're very lucky because my wife and I both work, and we're able to leave him home all day. Can you imagine that, leaving your dog home all day and then able to handle himself? And then, of course, we're lucky.
Yeah, I got the same situation here, and I would just walk mine because I thought if I don't halfway through this, he's going to start. I'm here alone this week. My wife's down at the beach, and of course my sons are gone. They're both one's working, one's having basketball camp, so they're both gone. And I thought I better get him out now, or I'm going to have problems.
You're going to be doing lots of maintenance.
Yep. And I had a friend who has a paper to drop off to me. She said, "I'll just bring it up and put it on your mailbox on your porch." I'm like, no, don't do that. I said, my dog can hear you 3 blocks away, and he'll start howling as soon as you come up on the porch. I'll just get it tomorrow. So,
yeah, dogs are great. Yep,
they are great. Yep. And this one's a good one. He's very smart, and I do tell a quick story with him. We bought him. My wife, as a joke, kind of a joke, bought a doggy doorbell for him. So I took his doorbell and I said, I'll have him using that doorbell in a week. And sure enough, within a week, he'd walk over and ring the doorbell when he wanted to go outside. And he'd just stand there and look at us and wait there, ring the bell. But it got to the point where he was ringing it, every 15 minutes. So we're like, no, wait a minute. So I removed the doggy doorbell. So it's no longer in operation.
My guy likes to bark at 5 a.m.
Oh, yeah.
Those 5 a.m. walks. Those are tough. That's the trade-off.
Well, John, we're so excited for you to be here. We love talking to you. Such a great historian of the Mountaineers, and have so much information to share with us. We're drawing close to opening day against Penn State, and I know it's one of the things you're going to talk about is the opening days in history of WVU and some of the more special ones. And I know, I guess the last really big one was the Ohio State game, and I think that was one that you were going to talk about a little bit.
When Frank gave me my homework assignment, I started to write down some games I thought that would be consequential. And, thinking back, that 98 game against Ohio State, at the time they were preseason number 1. West Virginia was preseason top 10. And I was working on the staff then. So I remember that game very, very well. And the lead up and the build up to that game, I think is somewhat similar to what it's going to be with Penn State coming up here this year. Before we get into the Ohio State game, I've seen some things on social media, and I've heard some people talking about the disappointment of not having a night game and so forth. Let me tell you something. Being on Big Noon on Fox on the opening week of the season is a very, very big deal. Only because Fox, that's the game they put all of their attention in marketing wise. It's the window that they have kind of claimed, or kind of marked out an area for. And just think about this. About in the middle of August on, what are you going to see on Fox leading up to that game? Promos. West Virginia, Penn State promos. That's their game coming up. That's their number one game to kick off the season. That's the first big game before you get into the night games. And the other thing, their big news studio show, which goes up against ESPN College Game Day. Well, the last half hour of that show is dedicated to the matchup. ESPN College Game Day, when they go around to different sites, they hardly ever talk about the game that they're covering up until maybe the end. The last half hour of that show is going to be all about West Virginia and Penn State. So it's a great, great opportunity for Neil Brown. I think it's a great opportunity for Mountaineer football. And I think when you talk about Neil Brown, I think he's checked a lot of boxes. He checked a lot of boxes last year, winning 9 games, winning that bowl game. I think winning the Penn State game would be a major box to check. And it would be one of those games, guys, that people take pictures of and put in their TV room, right? Yeah. That's the type of game that we're talking about. And that he hasn't done that yet. And so I think that's something out there for this program and this team. And to be honest with you, I've watched this team all spring. I go to the practices in the fall. I like their makeup. I like what they've got. I like how he's constructed this team. And I love the fact that he's got an athletic, mobile quarterback. I think that's going to be really helpful. And this is a guy now that's got a full season under his belt. And this is really the first time Neil Brown has had Jarrett Dagey, yes, but he didn't have the supporting cast around him that Garrett has. I think with the supporting cast that Garrett Green has around him this year could be a very interesting year. So leading that of course leads into the 98 High State game. And again, I see some similarities there in terms of national interest. I don't know if West Virginia, if they're going to be preseason ranked, but I think it's a team that could possibly, potentially be, or certainly if they win the game, that would take care of that. But I think it's a team that offensively could be really, really good this year, guys.
Mm-hmm.
I listened to, for some reason today, I switched on to the Big Ten network, and it just so happened they were talking to Coach Franklin on there about his team and the season coming up, and they wanted to talk about his Big Ten schedule. Mm-hmm. And he said, before we get to that, he said, let me explain something. He said, we're going down to Morgantown for our opening game. And he said, we are walking into a hornet's nest. And
well,
he said, I know that in the coach's point.
I'm looking at their schedule right now. I know we're getting into the history stuff here, but obviously the present is obviously the present. But, Penn State, after they open with West Virginia, they've got Bowling Green, Kent State, Illinois, UCLA at home. They don't go back on the road until the middle of October. So the entire month of September, they're at home. They don't play Michigan, okay? They don't play Oregon. They've got Ohio State at home. They've got a schedule that's kind of tailor-made if they can get past that first game of having the type of season that they want up there. They really haven't had that with James Franklin. He's been a very good coach for them. They've won a lot of games. They were 10-3 last year. I'm looking here, but he hasn't beaten Michigan. He hasn't beaten Ohio State. Those are the games that the people at State College are pointing to get him over the hump. You know, Mickey would know this better than all of us because he played against Penn State. I have my memory's terrible, so I have these files here that I keep. I have things that I keep that kind of remind me. That's how I come up with these things. I did some research on Joe Paterno when he coached at Penn State during the years when Penn State was playing an independent schedule before they went to the Big Ten. Now listen to some of these records here. Obviously, Mickey knows this because he faced Paterno, what, 3 times?
3 times, yes, sir.
3 times, okay. That would have been what, 68,
67,
okay.
67, 68, and 69.
And I think the 68 game, you guys were right there with him, right?
We were, yep. We had great hopes for that game, and as we did in 69 as well. Of course, we lost Oscar Patrick, our great wide receiver in pregame warmups in that 69 game, and they shut us out that year 20-0, unfortunately. But talking about historical players, both at West Virginia and Penn State, John, some of the players at Penn State, and I think I can recount a number of them from memory, you know, in their backfield in 69, they had Lydell Mitchell and Franco Harris. They had linebackers by the name of Dennis Cates, Dennis Oncotts, Jack Ham. Their tight end was a fellow by the name of John Ebersol that played for the San Francisco 49ers. Yep. They had an All-American defensive tackle that I got to line up, and a second-team All-American defensive tackle, depending on which formation we were in. Mike Reed was the first team, and he came out of Cincinnati. And a fellow by the name of Steve Smear, which is just a great name for a defensive tackle. I mean, they were loaded. I think they had something like 8 to 10 players that were first-round picks in the NFL draft that year.
Yeah, you didn't mention Charlie Pittman too, who preceded them. I mean, they were just loaded. Well, I was, I was looking at what Paterno did. During his time at Penn State, when they played an Eastern Independent schedule, he was 25-2 against West Virginia. We all know that, right? Well, look what he did. He was 23-0-1 against Maryland. He was 26-1 against Pitt. He was 21-4 against Syracuse, 17-0 against Temple, 13-1 against Rutgers. He was 16-2 against Boston College, 6-2 against Navy, and 9-1 against Army. There were only 2 times. There were 4 years when Penn State only lost 2 games or more against Eastern Independents. The guy's record was 150, 16-2 against the East. I mean, you know, that's what you're talking about with history, and what the guy did was amazing, obviously, and that's Penn State. That's what West Virginia's confronted with when they play the Nittany Lions. Now, obviously, it's not the Joe Paterno Penn State Nittany Lions. But they have, like Nealon told me, they dominated recruiting. They had the best players. And when they had all their issues with Pitt were the years when Johnny Majors and Jackie Sherrill were stealing some of their recruits. That was when Paterno had the issues with Pitt. That's when all of the back and forth with those guys went on, were those years when Pitt was somewhat competitive with them during those years. But, you know, that's been the history of the 2 schools. West Virginia, they always, when they would talk to Paterno, they would always ask him, when is West Virginia going to beat Penn State? All those years, he said, when they get better players.
Yep.
Well, I think it came down to regional recruiting, John, as you mentioned. You know, all the teams that they beat handedly that you recited there, that was the core area they were recruiting in, and they were nabbing, you know, the 4- and 5-star players out of Pennsylvania and Maryland and Delaware and
New Jersey.
I don't think they had any. New Jersey. Yeah,
absolutely.
New Jersey is a big, huge state.
They owned those areas, and they dominated it. And, you know, since then, since they've been in the Big Ten, I think '94, they went to the Rose Bowl. They had a great season. I haven't studied their history post the Eastern Independent days, but if you look at what they've done, it hasn't scratched the surface of what they did during those Paterno years. And I think it all goes back to they had great schedules. They had manageable schedules. You know, we talk about scheduling. Scheduling is so important. And if you look at West Virginia the last 4 years, okay, I can't remember. I think West Virginia is the only program in the country that's opened its season the last 4 years with a power conference opponent. Last year, it was 3 straight years on the road. They opened with Maryland, then they opened with Pitt, then they opened with Penn State, and then this year they're opening at home with Penn State. That's hard. That is really, really hard. And I remember Nealon telling me the story about scheduling. Dwight Perry and Bo Schembecker would tell him, okay, you've got so many games that you schedule that you know you're going to win. So if you have a 10-game schedule, you take 5 games, okay, those 5 games, you know you don't have to play great to win, right? You're going to win those games. Then you got a couple of games that you know you're going to have to play pretty well to win. Then you got 1 or 2 that you got to really exert yourself to win those games. That's the type of schedules that you need. And going back to the 98 game, Nealon always thought that 98 team was his most talented team in terms of pro football caliber players. I mean, you think about the long-term pros that he had on that team. His quarterback, Mark Bulger, Amos Zaraway, Gary Stills, Jerry Porter, Anthony Beck, on and on and on. Talent-wise, it was his best football team. And he felt had he started the season opening up, tipping his toe in the water, kind of like you guys did, Mickey, in '69 with Cincinnati, and you got some confidence and you built up as you went along, then you kind of get that snowball rolling down the hill, and pretty soon you got something special. He always felt had he not started the season with Ohio State that year, that was possibly a team that could have run the table. Felt a little bit. He felt the team in '94 too when they opened with Nebraska up in the Meadowlands. I remember that game. The highlight of the game for West Virginia was the punter kicking that 90-yard punt. And then you look back at the end of the year, and the best game that anybody gave Nebraska was West Virginia in the opener. So, schedules are so important. And the schedules that we've had, that Neil Brown has inherited, they were made 10, 15 years in advance. That's the schedules that we have. But I think you have to pay attention to that. I think that's very important when you evaluate a team, you evaluate a season. Hey, let's look. I mean, again, Mickey, I bring up the '69 season. Probably one of the 10 best, probably one of the top 5 seasons of all time in school history. Okay? Go back and look at the teams that you played. Nobody remembers that. What they remember is what you did, winning 10 games, beating South Carolina in that bowl game.
That's right. Yeah, Penn State actually was the only ranked team that we played that year.
Right.
Let me ask you,
Mickey, how many games that year did you really have to play your best to win?
2, probably, I would say. Penn State and Kentucky gave us a heck of a hard time. I don't know if you recall that game or not, John, but we barely won at Lexington. Again, scheduling makes all the difference in the world, home versus away. But we flew into Lexington and went down there to play University of Kentucky and got out of there by the skin of our teeth, 7-6.
Yeah.
Barely won that game. Otherwise, the entire season would have been a huge disappointment for us. And a piece of trivia for you. The reason why we won that game, and I'll never forget this, we were ahead 7-0. It was, if not the final play of the game, there was maybe 10, 12 seconds left. Kentucky had the ball on the 5-yard line going in. They scored, and then they lined up for a 2-point conversion to win the game, 8-7 instead of the tie. And they threw a little flare pass to their tight end, and he took it in for the 2-point play. You look over in the corner of the end zone, the referee had thrown a flag. And that particular penalty was an offensive lineman downfield, okay, on the pass play, which involves loss of down. So they did not get a second chance to go after the 2-point play.
Amazing.
Wow.
I think Mike Slater had a bunch of interceptions in that game, if I remember correctly.
I think he had three, maybe four. Yeah, he was really tough.
You mentioned that, and you know what? Kentucky was 2-8 that year. Finished at the bottom of the SEC. Nobody remembers that. You know, Pitt had Carl DePasco was the coach, and he followed Dave Hart. The people in Pittsburgh consider those among the worst Pitt teams in school history. I would say you could probably argue the Johnny Major's second run in the 90s there. They weren't very good then. But then you had Ben Schwartzwater at Syracuse. They were on a decline. If you remember, they had issues in the locker room. They had racial issues at that point. They were on a decline. That was a tough game you guys won. But, you know, that's not what people remember. People remember the end result. I could recite for you chapter and verse the 88 season. One of the weakest schedules any West Virginia team ever faced. It's the only time Joe Paterno ever had a losing season. Was that Rutgers beat Penn State that year. And you go back and you look at that season, it's people consider that one the greatest season of school history. Well, they also had a great schedule. But people don't remember that. What they remember is the end result. And I could recite instance and example after example after example.
Exactly right, John.
You know, John, I was going to say what's interesting about this opener is that you have Penn State that very rarely goes on the road to play a power team to start the season. They've been forced into it recently because in a number of years, the Big Ten opener is another Big Ten team.
Yeah.
And the same thing with West Virginia. Very rarely do they open the season. I think 4 times since the turn of the century, have they opened up at home against a Power 5 team. Well, that Ohio State game, that was the first time, I think, in 23, 24, 25 years that Ohio State opened the season against a major team on the road. So that makes this different from, for me at least, from last year's game when Penn State opened up at home against West Virginia. Your point, though, that you made is extremely important that people should remember, and that is the consecutive seasons of West Virginia opening up against a Power 5 team. A number of those on the road, but that's real. 3 of them on the road. Very important point. So I thank you for that.
Well, Neil Brown had mentioned in Las Vegas when we were there a couple weeks ago. He said, "I didn't do this. This isn't my schedule. I didn't make the schedule. I inherited this schedule." And you know, there's an interesting point. When Jim Carlin coached, he had a big say in the schedule. Now, he didn't play those games, but he was the guy that got them out of the Southern Conference. He said, "Listen, you know." I remember his exact words when he told me this. He said, "Mr. Brown," he said, "listen, the Southern Conference is killing us. We can't recruit in this conference, and we can't, you can't, Marshall's not going to do it. We need something better than Marshall. I want to play Kentucky. I want to play Tennessee. I want to play major programs. I want to go to bowl games." Now, he wasn't here to play those schedules. He handed them off to Bobby and particularly Frank Signetti. Now, Frank Signetti bore the brunt of it, but he's the guy that changed the trajectory of the way we thought, the way things were done here. Because in his words, he say, "Mr. Brown," of course, this is Red Brown, the athletic director. Red Brown was a basketball guy. Red Brown was a guy who loved the Southern Conference because of, and he was the guy, he'd say, "Now, Mr. Brown, you can still go to your parties with all the Southern Conference ADs and do all of that." He said, "But we need to be thinking a little bit differently here." And so I give Jim Carlin a lot of credit because he was the guy that changed the mindset here. Didn't play the schedules that these coaches did, but he changed it. And then when Neyland got here, I remember him telling me this. He looked at the first schedule and he saw Hawaii in the middle of the year, and he said, "This is the dumbest thing I've ever seen. Why in the hell are we flying across the country in the middle of the year to play a game in Hawaii that many time zones over at night And then we've got to come back and play a game against Pitt the following week. We're not going to be able to prepare for them until Tuesday, right? At the earliest. And then we got to go play the Panthers. So the next year or after that, they had a game just like that with San Jose State. And Nealon says, we ain't playing that. Get out of it. Buy out of it. Get out of it right now. That's how he thought. And he's like, listen, schedules are so important. And I remember him telling me the story too about when he took the job here. He would go around to different parts of the state and different places, and people say, when are you going to beat Pitt? When are you going to beat Penn State? When's this, he say, hold on. He said, wait a minute. The first thing we got to do is that we got to beat these other teams on our schedule. Okay. We beat these other teams on our schedule, then Penn State and Pitt will take care of themselves. Okay. And so I think he had the right approach. I think he had the ability to influence scheduling. And if you look at how he built this thing, I think that's the way you go about it.
Yeah, you're exactly right, John. I'll tell you. Go ahead, Greg.
Do you think that now with the Big 12, losing Texas and Oklahoma, the Big 12 is kind of, from the media standpoint, they're kind of taking hits like the old Big East did. Well, these teams are not really that good, et cetera, et cetera. You hear that all the time. Do you think that West Virginia needs these kind of games, not necessarily an opener, but somewhere in their schedule?
Well, I'll tell you what. Yeah, you talk about that. Well, I mean, perception-wise, they lost 2 blue bloods. There's no question. Oklahoma and Texas are blue bloods. Oklahoma gets great TV ratings. Doesn't matter who they play. They're going to have a bunch of people watch their games. Always been like that. Texas the same way. You're replacing them with Utah, which is fortunately West Virginia doesn't have to play them. Unfortunately, they play 2 through 6 in the preseason poll after that. So yeah, you miss Utah and you don't play the bottom teams. So you're playing all of the teams in the middle. You look at West Virginia's schedule this year. Take 2 power conference programs, Pitt and Penn State, rival games. Then you add the teams that they're playing. We play 9 conference games. Not all of the conferences are playing 9 conference games. There you see the schedule up there. So that's 11 power conference teams. Albany, you say, well, yeah, Albany. Well, they were in the FCS semifinals. So that's not like in theory it is a layup, but in reality it's not. So you take that schedule, that's a pretty challenging schedule. So you've got those games, and I know Neil Brown has talked specifically about that game in Arizona on Saturday, October 26th. Don't know what time it's going to be. There's a lot of logistic things they got to work out on that game going across the country. Then you come back the next week and you got to play at Cincinnati. So very difficult schedule. And the point I wanted to make about Greg's question, if you go back and you look at TCU 2 years ago when they made the playoffs, right? Made the college football playoffs, got to the big game. Their strength of schedule, you know what it was that year? 66th. They play their non-conference schedule, open with Colorado, which was terrible, right? Had SMU, which is a rival game, a city rival game, and I think it was Tarleton State. Those were their 3 games. Got them in the playoffs. Beat Michigan, got to the big game. So, again, people years from now won't remember that, but schedules matter.
Yeah, to that point, John, one of the things I like about the schedule this year is the fact that although it's much tougher than last year, we've got 6 home games, and then we got Cincinnati and Pitt right up the road, which are almost home games, right? So we got 8 of the games basically considered to be at-home games, which I think should help us from
7, right? Should again, Frank. I think we got 7 this year, right?
7, maybe 7. Oh, you could be right. Yeah, 7. And
yep.
Frank, can you put that graphic back up?
There you go. 2, 4,
Yep,
6.
7.
You got 7, and you're right. I mean, Pitt is basically is right there.
A little bus ride, and Cincinnati's not that far away.
No, I
right?
think that will end up being a bus ride too. But again, I mean, you play these
So
rival.
really,
It doesn't matter.
you got Oklahoma
These
State.
rival games.
Yeah.
They're hard. They are so hard. And, you look at what Neil Brown has done. He's had to play every year. He's had to play 2 rival games, whether it's Virginia Tech, whether it's Penn State, whether it's Maryland, whether it's Pitt. Those are hard football games. Doesn't matter whether they got great players or not. Rivalry games are very, very
Always difficult. Always difficult.
Hope you guys can see the comments coming in there. Somebody just said we would beat Penn State by 2 touchdowns.
Sign me up right now.
Penn State. Yeah, I'll take it.
If there's one more point on the scoreboard than the Nittany Lions,
that's
sign
right.
me up.
That's all you need.
Well, listen, we've only beaten them 9 times, and every time we've beaten them, we had parades.
Yeah.
Yeah, there you go.
So every time that we've won those games are all-time wins.
Yeah.
And Frank, they don't. Penn State hasn't been that successful, although they've won on the road in their openers. You had a graphic there I saw a little bit earlier before the show. I was looking at on Penn State's success on away openers, and although they have more wins than they have losses, several of those wins were by 1, 2, or 3 points. And it's not like there was any blowouts in those. I think there was one blowout, and the rest of them were very, very competitive games.
Yeah, this is
look at that.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Frank.
I was going to say exactly. Thanks for bringing that up, because you can see the major teams that they played on the road start in '94 with Minnesota. This is since 1990. Yeah. So John's absolutely correct, and scheduling is so critical. And the world changed for Penn State when they came into the Big Ten. I was at Michigan State for all those years, and it just wasn't the same team. And you can see that in 2015, and then in 2020, they lost to Temple of all teams, but that was a good Temple team. And then Indiana 36-35 in 2020, and the other games have been close. You got to give it to Joe Paterno. John's absolutely correct, and all the Nittany Lions, because what people remember, John's right, they remember the winning, but the competition matters too. And
I saw that graphic. You know what that strikes home? That graphic you put up there of Penn State. The big boys play people on their terms.
That's right.
They play people on their terms, and you see that there. So having Penn State come here and play is a really big deal. And
that's right.
We'll sell out the game. And just like the 98 Ohio State game, I remember that game vividly. The couple things I remember about that. Number one, there were satellite trucks from Losskill Hill all the way down. It seemed like every TV station in Ohio, West Virginia, and the surrounding states was there doing remote reports throughout the week. I remember that about it. I remember it was the first HD game in college football history. And I think it was only a sliver of TV stations in Columbus even HD capable, maybe one that could even carry the game. So nobody really watched it in HD. And it was a game, I think, that I also remember too about it was I think we broke a record for season ticket sales. And a lot of those tickets were purchased by Ohio State fans. And so there will be some of that at this game, probably obviously more so than Pitt, because Penn State obviously has a much bigger fan base than Pitt does. So from that perspective, having a local power conference team like Penn State, it's just a great way to open the season, and I hope the fans appreciate the fact that a team like Penn State. I mean, it's not often. I mean, Notre Dame. I remember when Notre Dame came here, that was a big deal. The year Eddie passed on, I remember Eddie telling me a funny story about that. He had gotten Dick Rosenthal, the AD from Penn State, on the golf course at Lakeview, and he said, "Hey, Hey, Dick, why don't you, this was after, I think, a few beverages, and he said, Dick, why don't you guys come here and play once? We'll play you twice out there. And he said, yeah, I think we'll do that. So that's how they ended up getting the game here the year that they came. And it was obviously great for West Virginia to have them here. But, I went down and I started writing down some of the consequential opener games here. And I thought the Tennessee game in Charlotte, I thought that was a consequential game. Particularly the turnout that West Virginia had in Charlotte. I thought that was a great one. The Virginia Tech game in 2017 in Landover, that was a neutral site. The Alabama game in 2014 in Atlanta was very
that was a great game.
Right.
Great game.
Right. And then I think the 2003 Wisconsin game was a game that that had meaning. And, right after that, again, Rich was a guy who had a hand in the schedules, and he said, listen, we need to think about this, because at the time, when he was in the Big East, he had Miami, which was every bit as good as Oklahoma ever was in the Big 12 during our time in the Big 12. I mean, Miami was a powerhouse in college football. Virginia Tech, Frank Beamer, Michael Vick, they had it going on. Then you had those hard games against Syracuse and Boston College and Pitt were all right together. So Rich is like, we need to think about this, how we're gonna structure our schedule. And they didn't open with Wisconsin after that. The teams that they had after that were East Carolina and teams like that were more manageable. But I think another game that you have to mention as far as openers go, guys, the Marshall game in '97 wasn't a national game. There was no national television. It didn't have a national appeal, but it was a very appealing game within the state. There were a lot of good football players on the field that game, and the best one obviously was for Marshall with Randy Moss. So that was the game that you think about. The game in Pitt in '96. I remember that game very well. I remember standing on the sideline next to Rico Tyler, who had just finished his career, and he was asking me about some of the players on the team. And I said, well, Rico, we got this little running back that's really that's pretty good. His name is Amos Zaraway. No sooner had I said that, he comes running right past us. It's the first play of the game for the touchdown. Now, he goes, oh, man, you know what you're talking about. You're a prophet. You're all this. I said, well, even dumb guys like me can see talent. It doesn't take a football coach or a football player to see talent. And so I remember that. And that game was always one that will stick in my mind. It was obviously up at Pittsburgh. Of course, the '94 Nebraska game was a game that really was a handful for West Virginia and Nebraska. That might be that football team might be the best team that West Virginia's played. I mean, they were dominant. Tommy Frazier, Corey Schlesinger, that defense. I mean, that was just an awesome football. I remember a funny story. We were at the Downtown Athletic Club where they have the Heisman Trophy in New York. And they had a reception for us. And so they had both teams there. And the guys were going up to the buffet line. And I'm looking at our guys, and some of our guys had some bellies and big stacks of food on their plate. And I looked at the Nebraska guys. I said, oh, boy, we could have some problems with this game, the way those guys looked. It was just a different looking football team and certainly a different type of game. Those are some of the games that I think about that were openers, that were consequential. I also think the '91 Pitt game. That was the first Big East game. Wasn't the first game Rutgers and Boston College play that afternoon, but it was the first night game. It was a national TV game, and I remember it was my first year working for WVU in communications, and my job was we had open practices, and Nealon was working on a no huddle shotgun offense. and he was going to bring in Darren Studstill to run it. So in those periods, those practice periods, when they were running the no-huddle shotgun, I had to escort the media out of practice. And so that was going to be the big surprise. We were going to come out of a Trojan horse and surprise Pitt with a no-huddle shotgun. Well, third play of the game, Studstill hurts his shoulder. Don't get to run any of it.
Oh, that goes out.
Get boat
That
race.
brings back John. That brings back memories of Bobby Bowden putting the wishbone offense in for our Peach Bowl contest.
Well, I'm going to tell you something about that, and I got the Jim Carlin treatment for that. I got the Jim Carlin treatment. I got to tell you this story, and I'm glad you brought that up because I wrote about that. I wrote about Bowden installing the wishbone, and Carlin read that and called me back immediately and said, "Boy, get your paper and your pencil out." He said, "Bobby Bowden did not want to run the wishbone. I made Bobby Bowden go down and talk to Darrell Royal and learn the wishbone. He didn't want to do it." He said, "Bobby, we have running backs. Oscar Patrick is hurt. Wayne Porter's not playing. We've got all of these running backs. You're going to go down there and you're going to learn the wishbone, and we're going to run the wishbone in that game." And he made sure that I knew that Jim Carlin was the one that was responsible for having that done, not the offensive coordinator, Bobby Bowden. So all the people that are watching out there right now, it was Jim Carlin that made Bobby Bowden do it because Bobby didn't want to do it.
Well, it's a high turnover, high risk sort of offense. But in retrospect, it's a good thing that we made that decision with that storm, that rainstorm we had that night. You know, John, we ended up running the ball. I think 78 times we ran the ball that night, and Sherwood threw 2 passes. As a matter of fact, we still have several records that go back to that day that carried over to the Chick-fil-A Peach Bowl. You know, most rushing yards in a Peach Bowl game, most number of yards by an individual back. Eddie Williams got over 200 yards on the ground that night. Sherwood has a record still for least pass attempts in a Peach Bowl, 2. Least passes completed.
He said, you know, Tony
just ran the ball.
Tony Constantine was the local reporter that came to all the practices. He had access. He had unfettered access. Rarely, you don't get that today. And Tony walked in one day in the coach's office, and he saw the X's and the O's for the wishbone. And he got Carlin aside, and he said, "Coach," he said, "I'm looking at these X's up here, and that looks like the wishbone to me." And Carlin said, "Nah, we're just getting some extra guys, some work and practicing or whatnot." So this goes on. Tony goes out to practice, and clearly you guys are practicing the wishbone. So afterwards, he says, "Coach, that's the wishbone you're running there." And Carlin said, "Tony, if you even tell your wife what we're doing," he said, "I will shave your head." And Tony, to his he kept a secret. He knew that you guys were going to run the wishbone, and he never put it in the paper.
Well, I tell you that I think was a precursor. The opener that year against Cincinnati was a precursor to what was going to happen with the ground rushing game that year. Because in that opener, which you called consequential, you know, people remember the score. It was 57-11. But it also, people had a lot of questions about having moved out of the old Southern Conference, you know, in that 69 year, what kind of team were we going to have? Now, my sophomore year in 67, we'd gone 3-5-2. The junior year, we went 7-3. And here comes 1969, our third year under Bowden and Carlin. And everybody's questioning, well, what's going to happen with the run game and Mike Sherwood's passing? Well, the score kind of speaks for itself, 57-11, but the ground game was huge for us on that particular day in that opener. We ran the ball 86 times in that game, and Sherwood threw 14 passes. I mean, we ran 100 games in that opener, 100 plays.
Who was your second game? Maryland.
I don't remember.
Maryland,
right?
Yeah, of course
Yeah.
you don't remember because you knew who the coach was. It was a high school coach, Roy Lester, WVU grad. He coached in
Is that
Rock.
right?
He had Mad Dog. Remember Mad Dog Curtis?
Oh yeah.
Linebacker.
Yeah.
He had him. Went to Maryland, and they were not very good. They were not. You guys, it worked. You guys built up, and you got better each week. You got more confidence. That's what I mean about scheduling. You played Tulane. They down in Tulane.
That was right. Hot New Orleans weather, humid.
Right.
You had to be ready. You had to be in condition.
You built up to it. You had Penn State in the middle of the year, and then after that, you had manager. You know, it worked. That's why scheduling is so important.
Yeah,
it is. And we always, or most often, we schedule Syracuse toward the end of the year because after the Syracuse game, you can count on 6 to 8 of your players not being able to play for the next 2 or 3 weeks after the Syracuse game.
You remember that? Was it the 67 game? You remember that? I remember Bobby telling the story. He said, we didn't leave Syracuse. We were evacuated.
Yeah.
There was they had a guy with a compound fracture in that game. I mean, there were guys that were seriously hurt.
Yeah, Tom Deegan, I think, was one of the backup quarterbacks. I think he'd gotten hurt. Bob Zambo. I mean, I can remember being at the airport. We waited hours for those guys to get out of the emergency room. And once they finally showed up, there's 4 or 5 of them. We finally got to get to go back to Morgantown. I'll tell you a funny story about playing Syracuse. In Jim Carlin's first year, we were practicing the week before the game. And as an offensive lineman, I was practicing going downfield as if I was a pulling guard, which I played, and throwing a cross body block against someone that was holding a tackling dummy about 15, 20 yards downfield. So we practiced that a couple of 3 plays, and Jim Carlin blows the whistle. He comes over to me. He says, Plumlee, he said, you're executing that cross-body block completely wrong. He said, when you go down there and that defender starts to come up, he said, you want to throw that right around his knees, not up around his shoulders where you're throwing it. I looked at him. I said, Coach Carlin, I realize this is your first year, sir, but the Syracuse players' knees are up here.
I remember Kenny Juskins. I remember him telling me a story, and I can't remember. There was a defensive back, Thad.
Couturier. Thad Couturier.
You guys were playing Zonka, and Zonka's getting 8-9 yards a carry, and Thad, he's like, "Come on, guys, come on. He's not that tough. He's not." And I remember one of the guys up front said, "Well, listen, man. By the time you get to him, he's already run through all of us. All you got to do is just lay on top of him. We're the one that have to bear the brunt of tackling that guy." And if you remember, not only did they have Zonka, they had Floyd Little.
Little.
They were loaded.
Always had great running backs. Always played you tough.
Schwartzwater had that run from Brown to Ernie Davis to Jim Nance, Floyd Little. I mean, it was just an incredible run of running backs that they had there at that time.
Well, and as fate would have it, it was a great runner on our team, Jim Braxton, who scored the winning touchdown against Syracuse in our very last regular season game in 69, which put us into the Peach Bowl game against South Carolina. Yeah. So, I mean, that was the era of huge, big fullbacks,
Yeah.
And you had your scat back, too. Of course, we had Bob Gresham, of course, playing the scat back, what I call a scat back. But Braxton he was a force to be reckoned with, buddy. And when he got to the pros, too, blocking for O.J. Simpson, always a huge force.
Interesting enough, I remember Carlin telling me that Ben Schwartzwater was very helpful to him. Schwartzwater told him, he said, listen, I like you. He said, I like my alma mater. He said, I want to beat you. But he said, anything I can do to help you, I'll do it. And I remember Carlin telling me that Schwartzwater was very interested in what you guys were doing in the times obviously that you weren't playing against them. So I think he was a great alum. He's an amazing man. And I remember a story that Coach Bowden told about Schwartzwater during D-Day. Have you guys heard this story?
No.
storming the beaches. He was a paratrooper, and he was storming the beaches of Normandy on D-Day, and they fought their way off the beaches, and they get into they get in their way into France, and eventually they have time to take a break after fighting for a day and a half or whatnot. And he goes into his bag and gets out an apple, and he proceeds to cut that apple with the bayonet that he was using to fight off the beach. He just wiped the blood off the bayonet, carved that apple, and ate that apple. How about that? A different time, amazing generation. A mountaineer, a true mountaineer, and a guy that was a true American patriot.
Yep.
No doubt. No doubt. Frank, you got anything you'd like to throw in?
Well, I was going to ask you, John, that list that you were going over, was there any of the games from the 2006 season that you had?
You mean, well, I just wrote down. I wrote, my assignment was openers, and I did start the 1963 Navy game.
Yeah.
And I remember a funny story there. I remember Eddie Barrett telling me that was the centennial year. That was the 100th year. That was the year that they petitioned the NCAA to let Chuck Kinder wear jersey number 100. And they went to the NCAA. They said, well, who can we get wear it? And they said, well, we have number blocks that are assigned for different positions. So the 80s were the wide receivers and the tight ends. The 70s were the linemen, 60s, so forth, all the way down. They said, well, we'll allow we'll allow a kicker to do that. So that's how I know Chuck Kinder has gotten a lot of mileage out of that. Well, that's how it happened. Was they said, well, we'll let the kicker do it. So he wore jersey number 100 for the centennial year. And Red Brown had a big list of things planned for that centennial celebration. I know they had a bunch of celebrities that they invited to like a gala in Charleston. I know Enos Slaughter was there or whatnot. One of the things that Red Brown wanted to do was they wanted to play up the Pitt game. It was obviously, so what they did was, that was a game that they convinced CBS to televise regionally. Back then, it ain't on TV much. The Navy game, the opener, was not on TV, but the Pitt game later in the year was. One of the things that they did was they had the Pitt team. They were staying at Waynesburg. They drove down to Point Marion, Pennsylvania. They got on a sternwheeler, and they rowed the boat into downtown like they used to do. I think the first time, that's how the teams traveled back then, was by steamboat. So they got him on the Rhododendron, I think was the boat, brought him in down below there on the boat launch there downtown. And then they got on a bus and walked up and did the game. Those were the kinds of things that Red Brown did. And I think in an email, when you guys email me about the question about whether or not the game was delayed, your opener against Cincinnati to make it
moved up. He moved it up.
To make it the first game of the 100th season of college football. I don't know that, but that's right in Red Brown's wheelhouse. I could see him doing that.
Mm-hmm.
I definitely recall it, having played in that game, John. The first college football game was 1869, and it was Rutgers against what was then the College of New Jersey, which is now Princeton University. But when Red Brown recognized it was the 100th season of NCAA college football, he got the start time moved up by 5 minutes. So we had the honor of playing in the first game of the 100th year of college football. Now, in researching that, I found another little piece of trivia, and John, I'm going to test your memory on this. Who do you think broadcast radio coverage, and who were the teams involved for the first commercially broadcast college football game on radio?
It was KDK, and I can't remember the broadcasters. Who were the broadcasters for that game?
Well, not the broadcasters, the teams.
Well, it was Pitt, West Virginia. It was KDK.
Exactly.
It was at the field in 1921, but I can't remember who the broadcasters were for that game. Yes,
I have no idea on that one.
First college football radio broadcast was the Pitt game. And also, if you want to do more trivia, the first indoor bowl game was the Liberty Bowl.
Liberty
Bowl. I remember
in New Jersey.
Yeah, and it was a national game. It was on ABC, and a couple things I remember about that. Kurt Gowdy couldn't see 5 feet ahead of him, and he had forgotten his glasses. And Doug Huff was one of the spotters. They used to have a student worker for each school. Doug Huff was one of their spotters, so he had to go back and get his glasses from the hotel so that Kurt Gowdy could even see the monitor so he could call the game. It was the national game on ABC. All of the big time reporters from the Northeast covered the game. Phil Pepe, all those big name writers from New York, and they just made fun of that game. They talked about because they had natural grass in the stadium for the game. It was in the Atlantic City Convention Center where LBJ had just had the Democratic National Convention, and they installed new lights, and they were worried about playing the football game in there because that was where they had the Miss America pageant, and so they were worried about flying footballs that were going to break the lights in the Atlantic City Convention Center. And the reporters, they would say, well, if the game gets dull, they had these like infrared lights that were to keep the grass growing. And the reporters would say, well, if the game gets dull, you can watch the grass grow. And that's what happened because Utah just ran West Virginia off the field that day. So
that's right.
Yeah.
That's right. I couldn't remember why I asked about 2006, so I looked it up. WVU opened up against Marshall, and the reason I remember it, I remember this preseason Sports Illustrated cover focusing on West Virginia. That doesn't happen every day.
No, it doesn't. No. Well, I'll tell you. It's funny. I don't remember much about the game. Honestly, I don't remember anything about the game. I know West Virginia was a blowout, but I couldn't tell you any details. I remember the one Marshall game when it was with the rain delay, and I remember they called it I think early in the fourth quarter. But that 06 game, I don't remember anything about it.
Was that the 12 game? 2012.
I think 11.
11. Yeah.
This year.
Yeah, I think it was the last.
I think Doc was the coach at Marshall at the time.
That's right.
I know he was upset when they called the game, but I mean, that's what I remember about those games.
Yeah. Yeah, it's
you never know in that opener what's going to happen, guys. I tell you, I've got great hopes, and I relate back to I think one of the best, even though we lost. When I saw. I think Trickett was a quarterback when they played Alabama in the Peach Bowl / Chick-fil-A kickoff classic here in Atlanta, and we only lost by 10. I mean, we represented ourselves very, very well that day.
Absolutely. The thing about it is you don't get practice games, you don't get scrimmages. First time you go out there, it's the real thing.
It's live, baby.
It's live. So who knows? Hey, who knows what's going to happen here in a month? You never know. We'll see.
You got a prediction for us, John?
Stay tuned.
Stay tuned.
How about we end on that?
There you go. Stay tuned.
That sounds great. I was giving gambling advice there a week or so ago. I said they're giving West Virginia 11 points. I said, if you're going to bet on that one, probably now's a good time. But I went on to explain my my limited gambling abilities. I did try to do a gamble on the NBA finals. I was telling Frank I placed a bet. I think it was 50 cents that Al Horford would score 9 points. I think that's what it was. Well, he scored 7. He missed a layup at the end of the game. He only scored 7, so I lost. So I go in there to look, and I'm like, man, I had $3 in here when it started, and I only got like 75 cents. I had placed the same bet 3 times. Didn't even know I'd done that. So I don't recommend anybody take my advice.
My advice is don't do it. Save your money.
That's what I say. You're not going to win.
But I do think it's fair to ask all of us, though, what do you think the keys of the game will be? Not necessarily the outcome, but what are you going to be looking for in the first quarter, first half?
Well, go ahead, guys.
Well, I'll go first. I think if West Virginia can come out and establish that they can run the ball some, I think that's going to be a key. because you know you're going to throw it, they're not going to get Green involved in running the ball. But I think they have to establish that early, if that they can move the ball against these guys, open up the passing game just a little bit. Defensively, I don't know enough about Penn State really to know about what's going to happen defensively, but got to keep them out of the end zone. Hey, what else can you say? So, but I think one of the keys is going to be West Virginia running the football.
I agree with that. Greg, I'd agree with that 100%. Of course, having played on the offensive line, of course I would agree to that. But I think the ground game is key to every team's success. You know, I think back to last year's game against Penn State, and if I recall correctly, it was pretty tight in the first half. And didn't Penn State score 24 points in the second half of that game?
Correct.
I think that's correct. So, yeah. So I think a lot of it is going to have to do with what kind of adjustments do you make and how successful are the adjustments that you make to what the other team is doing completely differently or a lot better than you thought they were going to be doing, and how you make those adjustments. And in that regard, I really think Neil Brown is long overdue on a big time win.
Yep.
You know, because his predecessor school, you know, he upset LSU at LSU. And he had a couple other major wins. And I think he's long overdue for a major upset here. I'm looking for great things to kick the season off that day.
I agree, Mickey, but let me show a slide we've shown before. And I think I'm going to focus on the WVU defense, because the biggest move that Penn State made over the season here, was their coordinator moves. And so I think one of the big things here is whether Penn State can move the ball against West Virginia. I think that's a bigger question than can West Virginia move the ball against Penn State. Obviously, everything is speculative, but they have Penn State as a new offensive coordinator. That's a little bit dicey, but also if you look in that second line, we talked about this a couple of weeks ago, John, is that Penn State has a new, and I was shocked, a new defensive coordinator in Tom Allen from Indiana University. And so I think the West Virginia defense needs to come up big time early and throughout the game against them.
Oh my! Something has captured. There he is.
There he is. Coming back.
Yeah, I had to run.
You've been abducted.
I'll tell you what, guys. I think the number one thing, they've got two great running backs. You got to stop the run. Those two running backs are terrific. They got good players. And then off of the running last year, play action pass, Aller was, I think, 25 touchdown passes, 2 interceptions last year.
Right.
He was great against West Virginia, but he had some so-so games after that. They're going to have to do a better job on him. I thought the passing game last year really hurt West Virginia. So
big time.
I'm looking at it defensively, because I think this offense is going to move the ball. I think they've got a lot of weapons. You know, here's something to consider, guys, to chew on. The last time West Virginia had 2 ball carriers average 6 yards a carry or more was 2006, Pat White, Steve Slayton.
Yeah.
They've got it this year with Garrett Green, and they've got it this year with Jaheim White. They've got some playmakers. I think these wide receivers last year, they were inexperienced. I think they're more experienced now. This Jaden Bray they got is pretty good from Oklahoma State. I think you're going to like him. I think he's a big physical guy. He was impressive toward the end of spring once he got comfortable. They've got some weapons on offense.
Yep.
You mentioned the offensive line. I mean, you've got, other than Frazier and Nestor, you got 5 of your top 7 back. So those guys all played basically the offensive line that played in the Meineke Bowl last year. They're returning. So you've got that. It's going to come down to defense. I think the defense, how they perform. And then the longer the game goes, the more the fans stay in the game. Obviously, those are the things that you look for in a home field. And I like the fact that it's noon, because you get right up and you play a football game. Don't have all day to think about it. Get everybody out there, get those Mountaineer fans all sauced up and juiced up to go. And let's take a big swing at the Nittany Lions.
There we go.
That's right. Sounds like a winner. Yes, sir. Well, John, I tell you what, it's been an absolute pleasure again having you on. We love to listen to you. We love to hear the stories and all the history. Mickey, you too, guys. It was great and good for me and Frank Whiskey to sit here and listen. That's an easy
I'm gonna
job.
say we dominated the conversation. You guys,
All right.
Frank and I go end up taking a pay cut if we don't start contributing a little bit more.
Are you guys, hey, Greg? Are you working by the word? I know Frank's not. You get paid by the word. I'm on these radio broadcasts with Jed Drenning and those guys, and that's like, hey, I can't get a word in edgewise. Now, Jed's got a two-part breakdown on the quarterback, Garrett Green. He's got a video. I think it's like 2 hours long. Down into 2 parts. I didn't know you could study a quarterback that long.
Yeah.
Hey, John, thanks so much. Thanks so much for joining us.
Always a pleasure.
Yep.
You take care. Thank you so much.
Yep. All right. Thanks, John. Bye-bye.
All right.
Take care, John.
All right.
He does a great job. I'll tell you.
He's fantastic.
You know, it's, and I've said this before, but it bears repeating with John and Tony Caridi, any school in the country, and then you add Bob Herschel to that. What a group. I mean, I don't mean to be leaving anybody out, but my God. Yeah.
And you just mentioned, you mentioned a game or a year, anything, a player.
Yeah, he's got a story.
Yeah, he's got a story.
Yeah.
He knows them. He knows what happened. He knows about the game. It just fascinates me that there's so much information that they can hold on to it. I can't remember my name from one week to the other, and I hear these guys spouting out all this information. It's just absolutely fascinating to sit and listen to.
Yeah, you know, and you and I have talked about this, Greg. What I think makes John special, it's this juxtaposition of grounded with facts where he does his homework and the stories, and the two together. You know, a lot of people who can tell stories, a lot of people who can spew facts, but to put it together is great. And talking about stories, do we have one next week? Our guest, we're going to continue Penn State, and we're going to look at the 1984 game. And the quarterback of that game, Kevin White, who's out in Arizona, is going to be with us. And we're really looking forward to that. He doesn't do many appearances on shows like these. And he's just an incredible person. And everybody who played with him, I mean, he was behind Hostetler for several years, but really came into his own in 1984. And who can forget this?
Yep. And I'll tell you, Frank, I was at that game, one of the most electrifying atmospheres I've ever experienced. And, you know, he, as a quarterback was, you know, I think, in my mind, looking back at WU's history, one of the more underrated ones. He was a really good quarterback and ran that team very, very well and could throw the ball. But he never gets the accolades, like you mentioned earlier with John. It seems like he kind of got overlooked there. Of course, he played in between some awful good ones too. And I think that's kind of what happened. He some of the people before him and after him kind of took all the headlines, but he was a really, really good quarterback. And I can't wait to talk to him. I think it's going to be fun because, like I said, I was at that game and man, what a night. What a night.
Electric.
Of all the games I've gone through, that was one of the more electric crowds.
And you know, I took we haven't started preparing for the game much, for the next week much, but I looked at his stats a little bit today, and that the stats for that season are quite good. But one thing I had forgotten, and I want to talk to him, we want to talk about this next week. West Virginia hadn't beaten Penn State since 1955. I mean, we had Gene Lathy on last week, who was on that 55 team. And then right after we beat Penn State, we lose 3 in a row.
Yeah.
That season, after the high of beating Penn State. And if I remember correctly, guys, we lost to teams that we lost, I think, to Virginia. We lost to Temple and Rutgers, I think, consecutively after that 17-14 win. And so one of the things to talk to them about, exactly what happened. Did the air go out of the foot? Yeah.
Yeah, you just kind of feel like they were so jacked for that game, and that was the season. You know what I mean? It's just like, I think after that, I mean, there were some injuries. I do remember that that they had a few injuries, key injuries, if I remember correctly. But you have to believe that just being so high for that one game, and the history of it and all that, finally getting over that hump and beating them. It had to be a letdown after that.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, it was three, not the best teams that we let
Yeah.
down to, but
That's right.
it'd be interesting to hear their take on that.
Yeah. And I think, and Glenn's comment here is about the Penn State game coming up. And the thing is, and I was just thinking, I run into the trap all the time of just focusing on the things that are sort of immediately controllable. Can you stop them? Can you run the ball? But turnovers are always a key. Nobody wants
Always.
and always. Special teams, you think about that Baylor game last year. It's Glenn, good comment. Really good comment.
Very good. Very good. Because, I'm going to guess 60, 70% of the games that are, that people win or lose are based on turnovers and special teams play that you don't really think a lot about. You think about, with that interception in the first half or whatever. You don't think about that when the game concludes. But special teams and turnovers will be key. And I think, the home field advantage is way into a little bit. I think with West Virginia's crowd, I think that'll be inspiring for the players. I just hope it, I think really key is getting off to a good start. Just, because if you think about the game last year, we got off to a pretty good start against them. And we held our own, and at halftime it was a close game, and the score really wasn't indicative of how close the game was. They scored a touchdown there right at the end of the game, I think, if I remember correctly. So it was a pretty good game. We got off to a good start. We hung right in there with them. They were just better. I think this year, I think the talent gap is going to be less. I know they've got good players. Obviously, they always will have. I think we have good players too, and I think getting off to a good start, building that confidence up a little bit. Like I said, the offense gets off to a good start. Proves they can run the ball. I think that's going to build the confidence. I think that's key. Just to be getting off to a good start, holding on to the football, and showing that you can compete with these guys. And once that confidence builds, anything can happen.
Yeah. And John wasn't kidding. He's the names of those running backs. Nicholas, it's in the third line there, third category. Nicholas Singleton and Katron Allen. Those are the guys to watch. 1,700 yards last year. Keandra Lambert-Smith is a good receiver, but they lost 3 off. That I think is the key, Mickey. Yeah. They brought in a new offensive coordinator. They're breaking in 3 old linemen new linemen, starters that went to the NFL. What I'm concerned about is that Singleton and Allen start running, and then that opens it up for Aller to start throwing the ball, and then it just goes downhill after that. I think that's really important. But those guys are great. The point that John made, they're great running backs. And Timothy's right. They have 2 great edge rushers this year. I think it's going to be a great game, and I understand what John's talking about, but who didn't want this to be a night game?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. There's something
Brian
special about the night games in Morgantown. I don't care what anybody says. If you ever go to a night game up there, you'll never forget it. Yeah. And I think everybody wanted that. And the quarterback too. Again, he looked like All-American against us. After that, he was very average. So you don't really fear that quarterback that much, but we do have to stop his. We can't make him look good again like we did last year. But containing those running backs is going to be a tall task. So I think it's going to be a really good game. I think it's going to be a fun game to watch.
Great.
Well,
guys, Mickey, good seeing you again, Mickey. Mickey's not going to be with us for a couple of weeks, but thanks for being here again this week.
Yes, sir. It was my pleasure, and look forward to getting back here pretty soon. I'll be back with you before the season starts.
Great.
That sounds great, Mickey. Appreciate it. Mickey with great insights too. And Mickey's a good storyteller. He got a lot of stories from back in the day as well. So that's always fun to listen to too. So we appreciate that. And we're so glad to have you back. And we wish you the best and look forward to seeing you, like you said, before the season started. Frank, always a pleasure to have you around to talk to. I always enjoy that. And we appreciate everybody out there for tuning in and watching tonight. Great show. John Antonik, a great historian for WVU. A lot of fun to listen to that. Next week, going to be a lot of fun as well as we talk to Judge Kevin White, who was the Mountaineer quarterback in 1984 when we finally broke the streak against Penn State. And that's going to be a lot of fun to talk to him about that. We appreciate you guys, our regular watchers. We appreciate the comments and information that they pass on all the time. We do appreciate that. Mickey, I saw Sarah on there saying she was on here and she was watching and said you look good.
All right. We got a new subscriber.
Yeah, we got a new subscriber. I don't know about her eyesight, but I think she's a good person to have on board with us. So we appreciate it. Yeah.
If you get down to Charleston, Greg, make sure you stop by her bakery up in South Hills. You will not be disappointed.
I guarantee you, I have been there and I am not disappointed. I've been there a few times. So yes, extremely good. Again, we appreciate everybody for tuning in tonight. We look forward to coming to you again next week for another episode of the Mountaineer Locker Room Then and Now. Greg Chris, Frank Fear, Mickey Plumley. Good night, everybody.
See you guys.
All right, Mickey.